iLearner. Learn today, lead tomorrow.
Have you ever noticed how much uncertainty surrounds us these days? Like every time you make a big decision, like starting a new project or maybe even planning your finances, it feels like stepping into a maze, right?
Yeah, definitely. You never know what's around the corner. One path seems safe, then boom, unexpected risks pop up, or maybe even exciting opportunities that you hadn't even considered.
It's like you need a map and a compass just to navigate it all, and that's where this deep dive comes in. We're tackling IEC 310-10-2019, which is like the ultimate guide to understanding and assessing all those risks.
We're going to break it down for you, give you the tools to handle those uncertainties and make smarter decisions. Think of it as us sharing our take on this super important standard.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just some random advice. It's a globally recognized standard from the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, the big guys for electrotechnical stuff. They're constantly updating it, so it's always on point.
Absolutely. If you want the full picture, head to their website, webstore.iec.ch.
Yeah.
We've got the latest versions, all the juicy details. And also there's a ton of related stuff like Electropedia. Really useful.
What's cool about IEC 3102 is that it doesn't force you into one way of doing things. It lays out a whole buffet of techniques for assessing risk. And it's all tied in with other standards like ISO 31000, which is like the overall risk management playbook, and ISO Guide 73, which makes sure we're all speaking the same language when it comes to risk.
It's a whole interconnected system. So first things first, let's get the lingo straight. The standard defines risk, and it actually pulls this from ISO 31000.2018 as the effect of uncertainty on objectives.
So it's not just about bad things happening, right?
Exactly. It also includes opportunity, like when things line up perfectly and could lead to something amazing, and you actually have some control over it. But here's the twist. What's a golden ticket for one person might be a nightmare for someone else. And even deciding to grab that ticket, that's a risk in itself.
Like, let's say a brand new market emerges. That could be huge for one company, but it could totally disrupt their competitor. And whether or not they jump in, well, that's a gamble. Potential gains versus the fear of crashing and burning.
Nailed it. Risk isn't just about avoiding disaster. It's about making smart choices in a world where nothing's guaranteed. You have to spot those potential wins and act on them too.
Then there's probability. Basically, how likely is something to actually happen? From totally impossible, which is like a 0, to a definite yes, which is a 1.
And a risk factor is anything that can seriously mess with that likelihood. Let's take software development, for instance. A big risk factor there could be the experience level of your developers. Do they know their stuff, or are they still learning the ropes?
Got it. And a threat, that's like the classic bad guy, right?
Yeah.
It's that potential source of harm, the thing you want to avoid. Often you have very little control over it. Like think of a natural disaster. Businesses in high-risk areas, they're facing that threat all the time.
Yeah, that's a good one. But the standard makes it crystal clear that uncertainty comes in many flavors. It's not just about specific events. It's baked into complex systems.
Right, like the global supply chain chaos we've been seeing. It's all over the place, and who knows what's going to happen next.
Exactly. Then there's the uncertainty that comes from just not knowing enough. Like you're diving into a brand new field and you're basically surrounded by question marks.
And let's not forget those black swan events, totally out of the blue, impossible to predict.
And get this, the standard even says that the way our brains work, our cognitive biases, they can stop us from truly understanding complex data or seeing the long-term consequences of our actions.
So our own minds can be a source of uncertainty.
In a way, yeah. All this uncertainty, it just underlines why we need a structured, well-thought-out way to assess risk. And that brings us to the heart of it. Section 6 of IEC 31010.2019, the risk assessment process.
So if I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and start assessing, where do I begin?
Well, Section 6.1 says, first things first, define the scope, context, and criteria. It's like setting the stage and making the rules for your whole risk assessment game.
So what exactly does defining the scope mean?
It means being super clear about what your assessment is going to cover. Are you looking at risks for a specific project, a certain department, or the whole shebang?
Okay, so figuring out the boundaries.
Exactly. The level of detail you're going to delve into and what kinds of consequences you'll be considering. Imagine you're assessing the risk of a new marketing campaign. Your scope might include like who you're targeting, the platforms you're using, and how it could affect your brand and sales.
Makes sense. You're drawing a line around what you're examining.
Right. And you also need to think about any assumption you're making, any limits you're working with, and the resources you'll need for the assessment itself.
You can't just assess risk in a vacuum, right? It's all about the context, the bigger picture.
Absolutely. That's where 6.1.2 comes in. Understanding the context means looking both inside and outside your organization.
So internally, things like the company culture, the resources they have, their goals.
Exactly. And externally, it's the economic climate, regulations, technology, even social trends. The standard emphasizes that understanding context is not a one-time thing. It has to be revisited and updated, especially when things are changing fast.
But like a company in a heavily regulated industry, if laws change, that's a massive external factor they need to keep an eye on.
Spot on. And then there's stakeholder engagement, 6.1.3. This is super important.
Stakeholders, those are all the people or groups who are affected by the risks.
Yeah, employees, customers, investors, regulators, even the community. The standard in Clause B1 gives you different ways to get them involved, like surveys, interviews, workshops. By tapping into their knowledge and perspectives, you get a much clearer picture of the potential risks and opportunities.
It's like gathering intel from all sides.
Exactly. Let's say you're planning a construction project. Getting input from local residents can help you spot potential issues like noise complaints or traffic jams that you might miss otherwise.
So you're preempting problems before they even arise.
Exactly. Plus, when you involve stakeholders, they buy into the whole process. It also makes it easier to communicate the results of the assessment in a way everyone understands.
Now let's talk about risk criteria. That sounds a bit more technical.
It is, in a way, but it's crucial. Risk criteria, as outlined in 6.1.6, are basically the benchmarks you use to judge how significant a risk is. The standard breaks this down into a few parts. First, you need criteria to decide if a risk is even acceptable. That's your risk appetite.
Risk appetite. So how much risk are you willing to stomach?
Exactly. The standard says this often involves figuring out how you'll measure the impact and likelihood of a risk and setting limits. Beyond those limits, it's a no-go. But, and this is interesting, it also says that sometimes you might accept a higher level of risk if the potential rewards are big enough.
It's like a high-stakes poker game.
In a way, yeah. A startup, they might be more willing to gamble on unproven technologies than, say, a big established bank that has to be super careful.
Different players, different risk tolerance. Got it. But when you're comparing different risks, how do you figure out which ones are more important?
That's where 6.1.6.3 comes in, assessing the relative significance of risks. The standard makes it clear that you can't just focus on the potential financial hit. You also have to think about the impact on sustainability, on the organization's ability to bounce back, any ethical or legal landmines, how effective your existing controls are, the worst-case scenario if those controls fail, when the consequences might hit, how much it would cost to put better controls in place, even what your stakeholders think.
So it's a multifaceted evaluation. A risk that might seem small financially could still be a big deal if it has ethical implications or could seriously damage your reputation.
Absolutely. Clause B.8 goes into various techniques for evaluating risk significance, taking all these factors into account.
Then there's 6.1.6.4, which is all about having criteria for deciding between different options.
This is when you're facing a choice, and each option comes with its own bag of risks, both good and bad. You need a way to compare those risk profiles and make the smartest decision.
Like choosing between two suppliers. One might be cheaper but less reliable, while the other is more expensive but has a rock-solid track record. Different risks, different trade-offs.
Precisely. And the standard reminds us in 6.1.6.5 to think about the relationships between risks. They don't exist in a bubble.
Right. One risk can set off a chain reaction, making other risks more likely.
Exactly. It's important to recognize those interdependencies.
And just briefly, the standard also stresses the importance of documenting everything, right?
Yeah, 6.1.7 is all about recording the outputs of your assessment. This means keeping a detailed record of how you did the assessment, what information you used, the risks you identified, how you analyzed them, and what you concluded.
So basically, a risk assessment audit trail.
You got it. You also need to decide how you'll store those records, who can access them, and how you'll keep them updated. And the standard is very specific about citing your sources. You have to be transparent about where your information came from.
Makes sense. You need to be able to back up your findings.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to section 6.2, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of managing information and building models. It's about how you gather the data you need for your risk assessment and how you can use models to get a deeper understanding of those risks.
So you've defined your scope, you understand the context, you've got your criteria set. What's next?
Well, 6.2.1 outlines the general process. It starts with collecting information, which is covered in 6.2.2. The standard points out that information can come from all sorts of places. You can review existing research, do your own observations, talk to experts, and of course, there's data.
Data, that's the lifeblood of any good assessment, right?
Absolutely. Data can come from measurements, experiments, interviews, surveys, the whole 9 yards.
But raw data isn't enough, is it? You have to make sense of it.
Exactly. That's where 6.2.3 comes in, analyzing the data. The standard acknowledges that this often involves making estimates, working with certain assumptions, and relying on expert judgment. It's not always a clear-cut objective process.
So there's some subjectivity involved.
Yeah, and because of that, the standard recommends getting a second opinion, having independent experts review your analysis and check those key assumptions you're making to ensure they're reasonable and well-founded.
So it's like a peer review process for risk assessment.
Exactly. And then there's 6.2.4, developing and using models. This is where things can get really sophisticated.
Models, like computer simulations or mathematical formulas.
Precisely. The standard lays out a step-by-step approach, starting with clearly defining the problem you're tackling and what you want your model to achieve. Then you create a conceptual model, which is basically a representation of how you think the system works. That might then be translated into a more concrete form, like a software simulation or a mathematical model.
So you're building a virtual representation of the real world.
In a way, yeah. You also need to develop tools to analyze the model's behavior, feed it with data, and then comes the really important part, validation. This means comparing your model's outputs to real-world observations to make sure it's actually reflecting reality and that you're using it correctly within its limitations.
So you're constantly checking and refining your model.
Exactly. Like in financial risk modeling, you might use historical market data to build a model that predicts future losses, but you need to constantly validate it against actual market movements.
Because the market is always throwing curveballs, right?
Exactly. Now, all these risk assessment techniques, the standard points out in 6.3.1, they all contribute to one crucial goal, risk identification, which is covered in 6.3.2. And remember, Annex A and B of the standard, those are your treasure troves of different techniques for identifying risks.
So those sections are like a toolbox for risk assessors.
Precisely. A key part of risk identification is figuring out the sources, causes, and drivers of risk. That's 6.3.3. The standard explains that by understanding these underlying factors, you can better estimate the likelihood of a risk, identify potential ways to manage it, spot those early warning signs, and maybe most importantly, find those common root causes that might be driving multiple risks so you can focus your efforts where they'll have the biggest impact.
So it's like detective work, tracing those risks back to their origins.
Exactly. Risk sources can be all sorts of things, specific events like equipment failure, decisions you make like forming a partnership, actions you take like launching a new product, ongoing processes, good or bad, and even existing situations where the outcome is uncertain. It all comes back to that fundamental definition of risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The standard also highlights that a single event or consequence can have multiple contributing causes, and these causes can often form chains, leading to cascading effects.
So it's like a domino effect. One thing triggers another and then another.
Precisely. But what's really valuable is the focus on risk drivers, which are explained in 6.3.3.2. These are underlying factors that can influence multiple risks at the same time. The standard suggests that addressing these key drivers can be a more effective strategy than trying to tackle each individual risk on its own.
It's like finding the common denominator of all those risks.
Exactly. Imagine a company where communication is poor. That could be a risk driver contributing to misunderstandings, errors, and delays across multiple projects. Addressing that communication breakdown would have a much wider impact than just fixing individual problems as they pop up.
It's like preventing those dominoes from falling in the first place.
Precisely. And Clause B.3 dives deeper into techniques for identifying these sources, causes, and drivers.
Now, you can't just identify risks and call it a day, right? You have to look at what you're already doing to manage them.
Absolutely. That's why 6.3.4 emphasizes the importance of investigating the effectiveness of existing controls. You need to take a hard look at how well those controls are actually working. Are they being applied consistently? Do they have the resources they need? Are they regularly reviewed and updated?
It's like a quality control check for your risk management system.
Exactly. You need to make sure those controls are actually doing their job. Now, once you've identified your risks and assessed your existing controls, the next crucial step is understanding consequences and likelihood. That's 6.3.5.
Consequences, that's what might happen if the risk actually materializes.
Exactly. Consequence analysis, covered in 6.3.5.1, can range from a simple description of what might occur to more complex quantitative modeling that tries to estimate the magnitude of the impact. This also includes considering those knock-on effects, where one consequence triggers a whole chain of further consequences.
It's like predicting the ripple effects of a risk event.
Precisely. The standard stresses that the types of consequences you analyze should directly align with the purpose of your risk assessment and the decisions you ultimately need to make, and you should be prepared to revisit your understanding of potential consequences as you learn more. For example, if you're assessing the risk of a cybersecurity breach, your consequence analysis might consider not just financial losses, but also reputational damage, legal penalties, and disruption to operations.
So you're painting a comprehensive picture of what could go wrong.
Exactly. And then there's the analysis of likelihood, which is 6.3.5.2. As we mentioned earlier, likelihood is often expressed as a probability or a frequency. How likely is this event to occur within a given time frame? The standard points out that many different factors can influence the likelihood of a risk, such as the reliability of equipment, human error rates, and external environmental conditions.
So you're trying to gauge how likely it is that those negative consequences will actually happen.
Precisely. And what's crucial to remember, as highlighted in 6.3.5.3, is that both the consequences and the likelihood of a risk can change over time. Also, a particular consequence or a certain likelihood might result from exposure to multiple different risk sources. Think about the health risks associated with a particular job. An individual might be exposed to a combination of physical, chemical, and psychological hazards, and we need to consider how these different exposures might interact and potentially have synergistic effects. The standard also reminds us that the duration and extent of exposure can significantly influence both the likelihood and the severity of the consequences.
So it's not just about the risk itself, but also how much and for how long someone is exposed to it.
Precisely. Now, the standard makes a very important point in 6.3.6 about interactions and dependencies between risks. Risks are rarely isolated. A single cause can trigger multiple consequences, and vice versa.
Right, it's like a tangled web of cause and effect.
Exactly. The occurrence of one risk can also increase or decrease the likelihood of other risks, leading to those cascading or looping effects. It's like a chain reaction, but with risks instead of dominoes.
Makes sense. So how do you deal with all this complexity?
The standards suggest that when these causal links are significant, it can be incredibly helpful to develop causal models. These models help you map out those interrelationships and identify any common themes, like shared causes, risk factors, or potential outcomes. This gives you a much more holistic understanding of the overall risk landscape.
It's like creating a risk map of the entire system.
Exactly. Now, moving on to 6.4.2, the standard addresses the importance of analyzing uncertainty and sensitivity. This is about acknowledging that there's always some level of uncertainty in our risk assessments.
Because we can't predict the future with 100% accuracy, right?
Precisely. Our data might be incomplete or unreliable, our assumptions might be flawed, or the future might simply unfold in unexpected ways. Sensitivity analysis helps you understand how changes in those underlying assumptions or data inputs might affect the results of your risk assessment.
So it's like testing the robustness of your risk model.
Exactly. And the standard emphasizes the critical need to communicate those uncertainties clearly to decision makers, whether they stem from variability in the system itself, unreliable or insufficient data, ambiguity in our understanding, limitations in our analysis methods, reliance on expert opinions, or a lack of relevant historical data. You need to explain what those uncertainties are and what their potential implications are for the reliability of your findings.
So it's about being transparent about the limitations of your analysis.
Precisely. And just as understanding the context is an ongoing process, so too is risk management. 6.4.3 reminds us of the importance of monitoring and review. You need to continuously look out for new risks that might emerge, any unexpected changes in the risks you've already identified, shifts in the broader context or in your underlying assumptions, and any new information or improved methods that become available for assessing risk.
So risk assessment is not a one-and-done activity. It's an ongoing process.
Exactly. You need to stay vigilant and adapt to changing circumstances. Finally, Section 6.5 focuses on applying the results of your risk assessment to support decision-making. The key message here is that all the insights you've gained should directly inform the choices you make and the actions you take. The standard reminds us that way back when we were establishing the context for our assessment, in 6.1.6, We should have also defined the specific factors and criteria that we would use to make decisions based on the risk information. It also stresses the need to communicate risks in a clear and understandable way, using quantitative units where appropriate. And as we discussed, you also need to be transparent about the level of confidence you have in the accuracy and completeness of your results and clearly communicate any significant uncertainties. Clause B10 provides guidance on how to effectively record and report these findings.
So you're taking all that risk data and turning it into actionable insights.
Precisely. It's about using that information to make more informed and effective decisions.
So in this deep dive into IEC 3110.2019, we've covered a lot of ground. We started with the basic definitions, explored the steps of defining the scope and context, looked at how to identify and analyze risks by understanding their potential consequences and likelihood, discussed the complexities of interacting risks, and finally emphasized the importance of analyzing uncertainties and applying the results to make better decisions.
It's been quite a journey. And remember, this is just our interpretation of IEC 31010.2019. For the full story, the complete picture, we highly recommend checking out the official document on the IEC website.
And we've really just scratched the surface here. IEC 3110.2019 is packed with specific risk assessment techniques that we didn't have time to explore in detail today. We encourage you to delve deeper into these based on your own interests and needs.
Absolutely. Techniques like brainstorming, checklists, failure mode and effects analysis, FMEA, scenario analysis, Bowtie Analysis. These are just a few of the many powerful tools the standard describes. There's a whole world of risk assessment techniques out there waiting to be explored.
We also encourage you to share your own experiences with risk assessment, any insights you've gained, and any questions you might have in the comments section of our YouTube channel. We love hearing from you and learning from your perspectives.
It's a great way to keep the conversation going and share knowledge with the community.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to ponder. In a world that seems to be getting more complex and unpredictable by the day, how can we use the principles of risk assessment, as outlined in standards like IEC 31010, not only to protect ourselves from potential downsides, but also to seize those unexpected opportunities that might otherwise pass us by? What might be the most surprising risk or opportunity lurking in your own world right now? Think about it.
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's a call to action, to really think about the role of risk in our lives and how we can use it to our advantage.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.